Okay, hi everybody. I'm Nick Gillespie. Thanks for coming out to Reason's DC headquarters for our panel discussion today about libertarian perspectives on abortion. This is obviously an important issue. It's one that's also most in the news recently from the Gosnell trial in Philadelphia, where a late-term abortionist was found guilty of, I guess, 3 counts of murder. This is also something within the libertarian community that is an interesting question, because I personally know people who are hardcore libertarians that are against almost any form of abortion, others who are open to virtually all forms of it, and various people in between. And what we're going to do today is kind of talk to representatives of those 3 broad viewpoints and kind of have a conversation first among the 3 panelists, and then also with the audience here. So let me introduce first, I'm Nick Gillespie with ReasonTV and Reason.com. We have Katherine Mangu-Ward, the managing editor of Reason magazine. We have Ron Bailey, our longtime science correspondent. And we have Mollie Hemingway, who writes for Ricochet, or edits at Ricochet, as well as GetReligion.org. Let me just go through a couple of quick points about abortion and how we got to a point where it was legal and what the current status of it is around the country, and then we'll open it up to the discussion. One of the things that's interesting about abortion, it was legalized at the federal level or by the federal government through Roe versus Wade in the early 70s. Before that, 30 states had abortion being illegal under all circumstances, including for the health of the mother. Another 20 states allowed for variations on abortion, ranging from things about considering the health of the mother, whether or not the child was likely to be born with severe defects, birth defects and things like that. Other mental health of the mother was a consideration in a couple of states, but essentially only 2 states, I believe they were Washington and New York State, before Roe versus Wade, actually had effectively abortion on demand that we have since Roe versus Wade. Roe versus Wade created a controversial trimester kind of set of criteria by which abortion was either more or less legal. Essentially, the Supreme Court, and I'm somewhat reducing this, but summarizing it, but the Supreme Court said that basically through the first trimester, a woman could have an abortion for any reason without any questions being asked. In the second trimester, the state developed some kind of stake in the disposition of the fetus or unborn child, and in the third trimester there could be fairly serious restrictions put on abortion. In 1991 there was another Supreme Court case which essentially changed that into the moment of viability, when a fetus that the state started having a real interest in the outcome of the pregnancy once the fetus or child, however, and we can talk about how we should talk about this stuff, reached a point of viability where it could live outside of the mother. To give you some quick updates, according to Gallup, which has been looking at abortion, attitudes towards abortion for many years, currently about 52% of Americans believe that abortion should be legal under some circumstances, 26% think it should be legal under all circumstances, and 20% think that it should be illegal under all circumstances. And interestingly, those attitudes have varied a little bit, but they're roughly similar to where they were in 1973 when Roe versus Wade was decided. Currently, 48% of Americans consider themselves pro-life and 45% consider themselves pro-choice. There, if you go back to 1973, there's been a vast change. In 1973, 56% called themselves pro-choice and only 32% called themselves pro-life. Last year, there was about 800,000 abortions performed in the country. Basically, since Roe versus Wade, about 50 million abortions have been performed. There's interesting range of estimates of how many abortions took place before Roe versus Wade, with credible estimates ranging anywhere from about 200,000 a year to about 1 million a year. And interestingly, there's pretty good documentation that during the 1930s, there were about 300 or 400,000 abortions a year. So abortion was not, even if it was illegal, it was not unknown. And we'll talk about, apart from questions of the legality of it and the morality of it, how do you deal with something that's going to happen regardless of legal considerations. And I guess we'll The one last thing that I'll tee up as a starting point. CNN and USA Today have been tracking attitudes towards abortion, the legality of abortion by trimester, and they found most recently that 64% of American adults think that abortion on demand, essentially unrestricted abortion, 64% believe it should it can take place in the first trimester. By the third trimester, only 13% think that abortion should be allowed. So, there's an interesting kind of slide as pregnancy gets closer to birth. People's willingness to say abortion should be an absolute right starts to dissipate. So we'll start with that, and we're going to have a quick conversation and hopefully an in-depth one, but I'll push things along. But the first thing that I want to ask the panelists, and I think we'll start with Mollie and work our way this way. How important is the question of when life begins to the abortion debate? What's your answer to that? And is it coterminous that when life begins, rights begin?
Okay. Easy questions.
Yeah.
Well, actually,
you're already running out of time, so please speed
in
up.
some sense, when the question of when life begins is not, it's not really that relevant at all. Everyone knows when life begins. By definition, human life begins at conception. So we're all in agreement on that. If we're all roughly,
I think that's a debating tactic.
No, I think. Wait. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I think it's almost like it's a truism. Okay. Human life begins at conception. The question is, when do human rights begin? Okay. I think that's. Well,
can you also define, before we get to human rights, when does conception begin?
That's just. It's like a circular question.
When two people love each other very much.
When a mommy and a daddy. When a mommy and a daddy love each other.
I never realized how little I knew about this. No, but I mean, is it what is the moment of conception? Because that actually has real ramifications for certain types of contraception. Is it when an egg gets fertilized? Is it when it implants in the uterine wall? Is it when it has developed beyond a very simple state?
I don't think there's really debate on that. There are debates about like when pregnancy begins. Some people say pregnancy begins at the moment of conception. Some people say pregnancy is sort of like a change that has happened in recent decades where people say pregnancy begins when the fertilized egg implants in the wall of the uterus. Right. But as far as conception, that's just a medical term for when the male material and the female material join together.
So it's fertilization for you. Okay, and do rights begin at that point?
That's why I actually just want to say I think this is really great that we're having this debate, because even though abortion is not the most contentious topic among libertarians, this question of when and how rights are, how humans have rights is very important to so many issues. And so yes, I would say human rights come as a function of being human, and they should begin when you begin. And so I sort of categorically reject the idea that we should be coming up with arbitrary lines, at which point other people decide that you have rights. You just get them by virtue of your existence. You should get them when your existence starts.
And so a fertilized egg has the same rights as anybody on this panel?
Well, do you mean in terms of like the right to life?
Yeah, well, I'm just saying, maybe
I think being libertarian means that you believe in equal protection under the law, and that people should have equal rights, and yes, the right to life is fundamental. So.
Ron Bailey, do you agree that the moment of conception or the start of life is not really a gray area, or not, and then, what about rights?
No, I agree that everybody in this room was once a zygote. Everybody in this room, everybody out there listening was once a fertilized egg. The question is, when do they have rights? When do they become people? And as a matter of fact, it's pretty well known that at least 80% of fertilized eggs never implant, they never create a pregnancy, they never become people. And therefore, I find it odd to give rights to things that don't become people, typically. So basically what I would like to do is that we also have a sliding scale of rights. People get more rights as they become older over time. We don't allow children to do certain kinds of things. And so I think that is part of that continuum, is that we can think about whether persons have rights or not, and when you become a person. And I would argue that at very early stages of our existences, we were not persons. We were not people.
How do you, but we also don't say, well, children, they can't vote, they can't drive, but they also can't be killed.
I understand that, but again, there's a sliding scale of when you get some rights. But if you want to say the right to life is fundamental, in some sense, it is in some sense, but only for persons.
When would you say personhood begins, then, if that's where rights begin for you?
At some stage, it would have to be with significant enough brain development to be able to have some sense of self-awareness.
Which could rule out half the people in this room, including myself.
The other problem with that is I'm very much more comfortable with viability as the standard, because that is at the point where someone else could decide to start taking care of the entity, the baby, the fetus, whatever you would like, as opposed to imposing the burden on the woman who's carrying the fetus to maintain it.
And you do agree on some level with Mollie, though, then that line of viability is either arbitrary or is always going to be revised based on new technologies or understandings of biological processes.
Yes, I do think it'll be revised, but the critical thing is whether or not the born child is able to be taken care of by somebody else.
Okay. Katherine, do you have a clear sense of when human life begins, and how does that relate to when rights begin?
Yeah, so obviously first I just want to note for those who don't know that I am also the hilarious token pro-choice pregnant lady on this panel, which, I suspect that this
We
whole
started
thing,
planning this many months ago.
Yeah.
So.
I suspect that this whole thing is actually somehow just like a practical joke by Nick on me. So let's assume that as our kind of starting point. What I actually think about this question is I don't know any of the answers probably to any of the questions that you're going to ask in the next hour. They're really, really hard questions. And Ron Bailey is an incredibly smart dude, and he just was like, viability, reason, self-awareness. He just said like 17 things that all are different places. And Mollie is a really, really smart lady, and she just said like, magical rights happen when sperm equals egg, or when sperm hits egg. And, as a skeptic of the idea of natural rights, there's sort of a whole sub-debate to be had there. But the sort of position that I'm going to take for the purposes of this debate is I don't know the answers. Lots of really, really smart people disagree on the answers. This suggests to me that we should devolve decisions on this to the lowest possible level, and that it is wildly unlikely that the state will arrive at the right answers and institute those in law in some kind of way that's morally pleasing.
So that means essentially that abortion should be legal and not ubiquitous, but widely available.
Yeah, I want abortion to be safe, legal, and universal.
And ubiquitous, yes.
Yeah.
No, but
no. That I essentially think at some point we just have the sort of biological distinction of birth, which I don't think necessarily has strong moral weight, but which has very, very strong customary weight. And that up to that point, it's essentially an individual decision, and that it's an individual decision not only on the part of the woman carrying the fetus, but also on the part of providers. That is that if we are going to have a regime where the state does not pronounce on the legality of abortion, we must also have a regime where the state does not force people to provide these abortions, because there is this tricky moral situation where it's tough to give yourself an abortion.
Would you, although it's getting easier, I mean, literally, this is part of, we're
all the yoga that Americans are doing.
No, but we're in the very early stages of gaining any significant control over our biology and our reproductive biology.
That's absolutely true.
And so
and
RU486, morning after pills, which are not abortifacients, but or at least by most counts.
But the one thing that has, I think, quite legitimately informed the abortion debate in the past is the fact that you must involve, particularly for later stage abortions, a third party who is also a moral actor who deserves to make their own autonomous choices.
Here's a question for you very quickly, and then I want to get Mollie's reaction to what Katherine was saying. Do you think the legal status of abortion changes the incidence, the occasion of the action? Because, there were abortions before it was legal and after it was legal and whatnot. We know libertarians talk a lot about drug use, and it seems from a lot of international comparisons that the legal regime is not particularly important in whether or not people choose to use drugs that are, legally or illegally. So, if abortion was made illegal, would the numbers change radically? If it was made totally legal up until the moment of birth, would that change things?
I actually think the prohibition analogy is a good one, and it's one that libertarians debating abortion in particular should sort of naturally weigh more heavily, I think, than other types of people when they think about this question. That we, perhaps better than any other kinds of ideologues or people of different political persuasions, understand that prohibition is not the same thing as eliminating that thing. And on the flip side, though, I do think law influences behavior, and people have fewer abortions because abortions are illegal. So if that is your only imperative, to reduce the number of abortions, period, and you are willing to accept the second level consequences of prohibition, then you may still understandably be pro-life.
Yeah, I think these are two completely separate questions. I mean, abortion has been around ever since women figured out that they could have abortions. They've been doing abortions, thousands of years of history on this. It's a separate question of whether we think as libertarians that there's a place for the law to talk about whether all humans have equal protection under the law, or whether we're going to prescribe that some do and some don't. But it is an important step, I think.
So how do you feel about what Catherine or what Ron were sketching out of, because we can't know for sure, then birth is the dividing line, or viability, which has changed even in the past, in the years since Roe versus Wade. Viability has moved backwards, or closer to the moment of conception. There's
been tremendous progress in terms of viability. Children that were born, 10 weeks premature a few years ago wouldn't make it. Now it's been pushed back quite a bit. But I just worry about the way we talk about these issues, because what we're talking about is that someone has worth only if they have a certain utility, or someone has worth only if they have a certain brain function. I think that can take us to a very dangerous place, and has throughout history, when you decide that certain people have worth and certain people don't, or you define sort of arbitrarily, oh, those are people, those aren't people, we can do whatever we want with those people, we can't do it with those. It's taken us to very dark places before.
Just to play devil's advocate, but we're always doing that, right? Because we don't mourn the spontaneous abortions of fertilized eggs.
Well, that's like, you mourn the death of your grandpa who's 92 in a very different way than you do if he'd been shot through the heart. That doesn't mean that those people have different moral worth. It just means that, some things are natural, some things aren't. I mean, yes, naturally some people miscarry. This happens very common for a lot of women. It's different than like going in and like tearing something apart limb by limb. I mean, it's very different.
But I wonder what do you mean when you say we, right? Like this is what you mean, we kimosabi. This is my concern here is, there is certainly a completely legitimate and rich debate among philosophers and, at bars, and sort of the cultural side of this debate, which I think is very related to another phenomenon that libertarians are keen on, or should be keen on, which is the notion of the expanding circle, right? That we are, one of the great triumphs of libertarianism, writ large across history, is that we treat more and more people like people.
Or like we treat ourselves.
Or like we treat, that we treat more and more people like one of us rather than others, right? And, that this argument goes all kinds of places, including the abolition of slavery and maybe
I'm just talking about the use of force. I'm saying we feel differently about the use of force to end someone's life than we do about
the phrase "we feel different." I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ron.
Well, the other problem is you're saying there is someone, and that's what I think is at dispute. Merely because I would argue that because it's a fertilized egg, that is not necessarily someone. You have to show that to me, and I don't know what kind of evidence you would be able to come up with that would, in fact, be able to persuade me. And I'm not sure what evidence I could provide you that would get you on my side of the debate either. I don't know the answer to that kind of question for you.
So, Ron, can I ask a question? Because one of the things that I wanted to move into is what's the role of science or religion or a philosophy in deciding these? Because on a certain level, we can talk about the biology of things and what's going on, but then it's not fully clear that science or religion or philosophy or ethics will actually give us the moral answers that we want. So if you can't say, here's evidence that shows this is a person, and you can't be persuaded, what do you use to go on? Where are you coming up with your ideas?
You do the best you can with the information that you have provided to yourself. I mean, you look at all the questions that are related to personhood. What happens to 80% of the fertilized eggs? That has some relevance. I think it has some relevance to it. Those are not persons. Or you think about a thought, here's a thought experiment. You have a 3-year-old boy and 10 7-day-old embryos in a laboratory that's catching on fire, and you can only save one. Which one do you save, the 3-year-old or the 10 7-day-old embryos?
How long did it take us to get to lifeboat ethics?
Exactly. But my point is that you have, everybody has different intuitions about this particular issue, I think. And you try to do the best you can. You struggle with it. And you also try to think about what it is that you're trying to impose on women as well. You're trying to think, well, do you want to force women to have children that they don't want? And so it's a whole panoply of things that comes to what you yourself can do in the honesty of your own heart. But
just very quickly to pick up on that, because then we'll go on to a couple other points. One of the things that's interesting is that even a lot of very staunch opponents of abortion will say, okay, no abortions except in the case of the life, to preserve the life of the mother, which is a kind of longstanding medical precept that if you can save one life, that's better than losing two. And we could argue that, but then they'll also say, and in the case of rape and incest, Mississippi, in researching this, interestingly, the only cause before Roe versus Wade that Mississippi allowed abortion for was incest, not rape, but incest. And it's kind of like if you're the Mississippi Tourist Board, you would probably want to rethink that and come up with more, why would incest be the only thing that would legitimate it? But can we all agree on some level that, obviously, okay, that's it, cut. But, that these carving out exceptions for things like rape and incest, possibly even the life of the mother, seem kind of strange, because it's like, the argument against rape is that, well, a woman didn't consent to become pregnant or have this child, but then it's like, okay, and so to make it all right, we're going to kill the kid.
I actually don't think it's weird. I mean, I think that's how we make all of our moral decisions. I mean, everybody has these incredibly complex and individualized preferences, and when you talk to individual women about why they have abortions, everyone has a different reason. Everyone has a different series of things that they valued in a different order. And I guess I think the weird part is, why have we empowered state legislatures or courts to say, these 3 things are good reasons, these 37 things are bad reasons? It doesn't strike me as weird that we would have a long list of reasons and want to accept some and reject others.
Very quickly, by the way, according to survey data, the top 2 reasons that women cite for getting an abortion, one is that they want, 26% say they want to postpone childbirth, and 21% say it's because they don't have the money or the means to take care of the child. But Ron, you were going to...
Well, no, historically, one of the fascinating things is abortion in the United States was not illegal until the 1830s at all. Every state, it was legal. And there was no prohibition whatsoever against it. And why did we get the prohibitions? It wasn't the Catholic Church or anything like that. It was the American Medical Association. It was a bunch of basically white Protestant guys who wanted to take away midwifery and take over the obstetrics on their hand. And they were also very concerned, and you can go back and reread the history of all this, basically they're very concerned because the Irish Catholics were having too many babies and the white Protestant women weren't. Therefore, we were going to force the white Protestant women to have babies by outlawing abortion. And that's just historically the fact. And by essentially the late 1860s, it was illegal in every state.
That gets into the whole crazy progressive and eugenics past of the general abortion movement. But I just want to say, one thing that really concerns me about the way we're talking about this...
I'm sorry, how does that get into the progressive?
Well,
this was the American Medical Association of the 1840s.
That when you look at looking back into 100 years ago and whatnot, there was a lot of eugenics motivation for abortion and our general culture there.
Certainly eugenics started to factor into discussions of control of reproduction.
Right. But what I'm concerned about is how we're talking about an entire class of people and deciding that they're not people, and we're sort of making this arbitrary, and we're saying, oh, well, why should we say that women can or can't do this? Well, we're forgetting to talk about the people that are involved, the human beings that are killed because we think that we should not have any say in what women are doing. It's not just a function. There are competing rights in play, and I think that it's important to talk about all the parties involved when we are talking about ending human life in the womb.
And on that, if people could quickly comment on what's the role of the father in this, because there's the rights of the mother, competing rights, the rights of the mother, the rights of the fetus or child, and then there's the father. Do they have any role to play? Ron, you seem to be staking out the most feminist position, self-consciously feminist position, so let's start with you.
I actually think that they probably have no role in deciding that. I would hope that couples who come to this decision will talk about it, but ultimately it is really going to have to be the woman's decision because it is her body, and what is happening to her is happening to her.
I mean, there's a great deal of illogic on that part, too, though. When you talk about if this child does somehow escape the birth canal, then we have the fathers being completely responsible for them, but they have no say in whether they make it out of the birth canal. But we do punish them if they procure an abortion for the woman that they impregnated, particularly against her will. I mean, there's a lot of illogic in the legal structure here.
And again, I
agree with you.
I would just take the position that, yes, there is a lot of illogic in the legal structure, all the more reason to strip down the legal structure, to remove this from the business of the law and make it the business of individuals. And I think you're right to say that, many, many people, I think most people, and certainly more and more people as history progresses, will consider the fetus/baby to be a person worthy of consideration, to be a moral entity in this calculation. But we also, for instance, agree that it is a morally permissible decision to shoot someone in self-defense if they're attacking you. We also agree that that the right to life is not one that somehow everyone is very mushy on in this abortion debate and then hard line on in every other circumstance. It's just not true. We have gray areas everywhere, and the places where we can let people, including fathers, make their own moral choices about this and not draw bright lines arbitrarily by the state, I think is the libertarian position and coincidentally the right position.
What do you guys make of the fact? I mean, there's some paradoxical results in the survey data. As I was saying, the overall numbers of people who say that abortion should be legal under some circumstances, all circumstances, under no circumstances, hasn't really changed that much. Since the early 70s. But the number of people who call themselves pro-life has actually increased. And the number of state restrictions that have been placed on abortion procedures has increased dramatically, especially over the past 10 years, but especially in the last 2. Could it be possible that people are still generally comfortable with the idea of abortion under some circumstances, particularly in the first trimester, even as they're recognizing more and more rights or potential personhood for the fetus?
I think those survey results are actually encouraging from the perspective of a potentially more libertarian outlook by the general population. I mean, what you're describing is people are generally more comfortable with the idea of abortion being legal, even as they are maybe are simultaneously less comfortable with actually actually having abortion than people having abortion.
Is that even true necessarily by the data, though? Are
well,
people
if people
having
say,
fewer abortions?
I mean, it's
they actually are, both in raw numbers and in rates. It peaked around in the late 80s.
Certainly demonstrated preferences are relevant here, no doubt about that, but just to the extent that people are saying they're pro-life and also saying, the sort of Venn diagram of people who are saying they're pro-life and are saying abortion should be legal, are perhaps the people who are wary of these increasing state restrictions.
Could I ask a quick question as well? I'm just curious, what do you think of the moral status of embryos that are produced for in vitro fertilization that are actually in lab dishes?
That is, I don't know what you mean exactly by that.
Are they persons?
Yes,
Okay.
I think that.
That's all I want.
Gone.
Okay. Okay. Well, let me ask you.
Oh no, I know what I was going to say. One thing I don't think is good though is to have this discussion with too much of an eye toward public opinion. Meaning, as libertarians, I think that we should advocate things or oppose things on principle and not based on whether it's tough or not. And a lot of things that we advocate that used to be deeply unpopular are now growing in popularity in part because of their principled approach to it. Anything from drug legalization.
I think that's a very good point, but it's also interesting just to see how it seems like there are broad cultural shifts because where abortion became possible, it became imaginable, not because of Roe versus Wade. Roe versus Wade is actually kind of an emanation of that based on a variety of cultural trends. So it's always interesting. I agree, principles matter, but it's always interesting to look in a larger context. Let me ask you, since you write for getreligion.org, is there a role for religion in setting abortion policy, or how does that influence? In the same way I'd ask Ron about science, because it seems to me science is not particularly helpful or it's not determinative in this. How does religion kind of factor into your thoughts about what's good public policy?
Well, I think there's always a role for religion in the same way there's a role for any belief system, and that a vibrant public square should hear from all sorts of perspectives. From the libertarian perspective, I don't really think it plays too much of a role, except there was something that Katherine picked up on when she referred to natural rights as kind of magical. And there is a truth that when you look at the history of of our country, our founding fathers definitely thought of natural rights being endowed by creators. If you reject a belief in God, it seems like sometimes there's also a rejection of natural rights that goes along with that. So I think that it's interesting, but it's not like a direct, there's no direct role necessarily.
And it's clear we define natural rights differently than the founding fathers did.
Do we?
I think there's large percentages of the population.
Yeah.
Could I say a quick thing on the religion thing? One of the, and I think religion obviously has a legitimate place in the debate. The problem is that, if God is telling you that a fertilized egg is a human being, why would you ever pay any attention to Ronald Bailey? I mean, that kind of precludes an argument in a certain sense, because you already have a reason to think that way, provided transcendentally, and the debate is over. There is no debate.
It's probably worth noting, too, that historically speaking, people who are religious, particularly of the Judeo-Christian variety, tend to have a more expansive view of human rights as compared to, say, like communist countries that officially rejected religion and rejected all sorts of human rights that go along with it. So if there's a danger there, I think the danger for a libertarian is that a world that's particularly hostile to religion is a world that tends not to have a very high view of civil liberties in general.
I'm not sure that's actually the right account of history, though. That is, you're absolutely right that religious thinkers and religious people were and are crucial in this sort of expanding circle, right? This notion of rights and of other individuals as being worthy of respect and equal treatment. But I think that the recent history of that is just as much a secular phenomenon as it is a religious phenomenon. And I'm not convinced that sort of the rise of secularism equals the decline of natural rights at this point. I do think that there have been moments in human history when secularism and lack of respect for human rights have been intertwined, but I don't believe that is a necessary relationship.
Let's go into a final kind of series of questions, and then we'll open it up for the audience. What's the role of the state, then, in either prohibiting or regulating abortion? Very quickly, Mollie, what would you say?
Well, I just want to say, I think this is actually why a lot of libertarians get along and don't disagree too much. All of the debates that are about abortion right now are about whether the state should be funding abortion, funding embryonic stem cell research, forcing employers to pay for abortifacients and whatnot. It doesn't matter how much our views differ. We probably agree to a large perspective on that. So when you look at the actual debates about the government, there's a lot of agreement in libertarian circles. I do think I think that even the most strenuous pro-life advocate would say that most of what needs to be accomplished in terms of creating a culture that respects life happens outside of the state. Should the state have laws that give equal protection to all humans? Absolutely. So,
I mean, you would be comfortable with ending abortion on demand, essentially? I mean, the policy that we have. Yeah. Ron, what about, what's your sense of what's the state's role in this? And if abortion, I mean, you believe abortion should be legal. One of the things that came out of the Gosnell trial in Philadelphia was, there was a regulatory regime in place that really was obviously totally asleep in any number of ways. But, should the state be placing limits on abortion, and then how should it be regulated?
I would like to associate myself with Katherine Mangu-Ward's comments. No.
Yeah.
I mean, essentially, to the extent you need a regulatory regime to ensure safety and that kind of thing, that's fine. I'm not going to too strenuously worry about that. But essentially, there should be no role in the state making decisions with regard to this procedure. Sorry.
Okay. Katherine?
Ron's use of the word safety sent Mollie's eyebrows disappearing into her hairline. So if anyone wants to sort of poke that
safety
wound
for
later.
the woman who is a person.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I basically think that the state has shown itself time and time again to be spectacularly inept at enforcing prohibitions of things that people want to do, that it has been spectacularly inept in drawing regulatory bright lines that are not also that don't also produce unintended consequences of epic proportions, and that if we think that, for instance, markets are so complicated and so subtle that attempts by the state to regulate them will invariably fail. I guess I don't see why a sort of far more important moral question would somehow be something that the state would be equipped to handle.
And then just the final question before we go to the audience. Do your positions on abortion have any implications for your positions on contraception or other forms of kind of reproductive technologies? And I guess, Mollie, you would say if in vitro eggs have full personhood, does that change, more procedures than just what we're talking about in terms of abortion?
I'm not quite sure what you're getting at with that, although I do wish people would learn a lot more about contraception, how it accomplishes what it's intended to accomplish, and what happens if the initial efforts to contracept fail, whether you're
well, I mean, some
ending
contraceptions seem to be, they prevent fertilizations, others are abortifacients, by your telling.
Right, and sometimes we call abortifacients contraceptives, which can make it confusing. What I do think is important, though, is that people also think about IVF and all sorts of assisted reproductive technologies and what they're doing. There's sort of movements to kind of create embryos for harvesting and whatnot. And this, again, is just, it's kind of very scary territory to go into, and I wish people would really think about what the technology means, the lives they're creating, and how they're treating those.
Ron?
I have thought about that considerably, I would like to think, and one of the things I was very puzzled by when I was thinking about this debate, I went and looked back at a statement that former Pope Benedict said basically about IVF, where he said, if you've created embryos that in fact have genetic defects, perhaps Tay-Sachs or something like that, they should nevertheless be implanted. They are people. And I find that to be horrific, as a matter of fact. Basically, you're creating lives that will not be conscious. The Tay-Sachs baby is in a horrible, horrible, painful position to be in. Those are the kinds of logical consequences that come from treating every fertilized egg as a person. They simply are not, and you end up in all kinds of cul-de-sacs where you will cause much more harm than you would do good, I would think.
Catherine?
I just want to end also on the warm, fuzzy Mollie Hemingway note of commonality of agreement here. I mean, I think it is exactly right to say that despite the very widely varying positions, we all come to a lot of the same places on actual policy prescriptions, and I think contraception is a great example of that. That contraception, A-OK in my book, but forcing any entity, and not just people with religious objections, but a corporation with their eye on the bottom line, or whatever it might be, forcing people to pay for contraception, forcing doctors or medical providers to prescribe it, to perform abortions. All of those things are just as objectionable from the overweening state power perspective as any of the rest of this.
All right. Well, let's have a hand for Mollie Hemingway, Ron Bailey, and Katherine Mangu-Ward. And let's have some questions from the audience. Who has a question? Okay. And there's Phil Harvey.
Yeah,
obviously somebody does. So, okay. Phil, if you could introduce yourself and then ask your question.
My name is Phil Harvey. I'm with DKT International, a family planning organization. I'm curious about what we once called a decent respect for the opinions of mankind. It seems to be a fact that modern democracies generally liberalize abortion laws. That is, they become relatively permissive, assuming, putting aside the communist and other authoritarian regimes, assuming that modern democracies are reasonably expressive of the desires and principles of their people. Does this not suggest, particularly to you, Mollie, that human beings, persons, whatever, have a tendency to find the availability of abortion, at least in the early trimesters, to be less objectionable than all of the horrors that attend illegal abortion?
It's kind of interesting to think about the horrors that attend illegal abortion right after this Kermit Gosnell trial, which took place after decades of legal abortion and a regime that completely supports that. And yet still we have feline-infested, flea-riddled clinics with women being killed and a guy who was just convicted of 3 charges of first-degree manslaughter, which suggests that maybe there's something about the abortion culture that also leads to a general dehumanizing of patients and whatnot. But I don't really think the fact that people are generally supportive of something in a certain point in time really means that much. I mean, we have in very recent history had some pretty horrific examples of people being generally supportive of absolutely horrible treatment of their fellow man, deciding that entire classes of people do not have the right to life or liberty or their property. It happens all the time, and I think that it is incumbent upon people who do respect life that we educate people, have strong social institutions that encourage people not to destroy life or initiate force against their fellow man. That works not just in terms of abortion, but all the ways that we initiate force against people when we don't have the right to.
Ron, were you about to say something?
I just wanted to object this notion that there's a whole regime that supported Gosnell. I do want to point out that he is in fact in jail for murder. So I don't think
after how many decades of doing what he
I
did?
suggest to you that we had a
people?
terrible regulatory regime.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but it is interesting that Gosnell is exactly the type of person who should not exist in a legalized
But he
abortion.
would exist in an illegal world.
Right.
That's my point.
Yeah. Okay, very good. Other questions? Yes.
I'm Patrick Melody. I'm not particularly affiliated with anyone at this point.
But you are wearing a Reason.
But I do have a Reason T-shirt, sure. So yeah. Anyway, thanks for saying me that, Nick. So Ron, I have a question for you. You seem pretty convinced that a zygote is not in fact a person, though it, I suppose, is human. You've also alluded that you've said it's, what's a person, who's a person, are you conscious, or, you've said that these things are, of course, extremely difficult, from both a scientific point and also, I guess, a moral, non-scientific point of view. It's very hard to determine this anyway. So my question is there in principle, any proposition or something that would look like a proposition that you can think of that if we could prove it to you, or if we could show very compelling evidence that was very likely true, is there something that would change your mind? Is that in principle possible? What would that look like?
If I have been writing about stem cells and abortion and so forth for 20 years. I've been looking for that principle that entire time. I've read I think fairly widely in the field, and I cannot find out what that would be. In principle, yes, there should be something that could persuade me one way or the other, but it would be hard to, I just haven't encountered an argument in favor of that at this point. If you happen to have one, let's have a drink sometime and discuss it. But I don't see it out there. It's just an empirical matter. And that's, I guess, where I have to come down on that. Another way to think about it, though, we can also lose our humanity over time as adults. And one of the problems, of course, is you could be brain dead. And we don't treat people former people almost, we'll have to refer to them as, if they're brain dead, we can harvest their organs. They don't have brains anymore. And to that extent, that kind of thinking might also inform a little bit about what we should think about entities that don't have brains in the first place, which would be zygotes, and whether they deserve the same sorts of rights as people who do have working brains.
Ron, could you very briefly also just talk about the creation of the concept of brain death and where does, how recent is that as a diagnostic
That's
tool?
incredibly recent. As people probably may or may not remember, the first heart transplants actually took place in South Africa in the early 1960s, and they were using the hearts from people who were in car accidents and brain dead, basically kept on life support. And this was incredibly controversial at the time, and you could read newspaper headlines that they were murdering people to steal their organs and that kind of thing. And so a committee met at Harvard in the late 1960s to come up with a definition, if they could, which was basically whole brain death, basically that you need to be on life support entirely in order to be considered dead. And so, but until that point, death for most human beings was the cessation of a heartbeat. But now we had a different opinion because we have different ways of thinking about what constitutes human identity. And a large part of that has to do with having a working brain.
Other questions? Yeah.
Hi, I'm David Barnes with E21 Economic Policies for a 21st Century. My question's for Katherine. You started off, before getting sidetracked, talking about the expanding circle of liberty, and I want to know why you think that fetuses still in the womb aren't maybe the next stop in that expanding circle.
I think they might be, but I think that the whole kind of force of, and it's not the expanding circle of liberty, the term originates with a more general concept, I think, of an expanding moral circle or a circle of usness rather than otherness, as Nick alluded to. I am quite open to the fact that fetuses and cows are currently kind of the leading contenders for the next entity to be welcomed into the circle. But those are first and foremost cultural decisions. They are decisions that should be made on the individual level, in the same way that I think even the vegetarians among us, many vegetarians among us might not think that it's appropriate to sort of immediately confer the rights of humans onto cows if we decide that we can't treat them any old way we want. At the same time, I think there is lots of gray area. There's lots of moral gray area as well as legal gray area between fetuses might be people too, and fetuses deserve all of the protections under the law of people right now. So I am open to the question, open to the notion that in the future that we will actually look back and say we are thoroughly embarrassed at ourselves for our treatment of fetuses. I do not yet think we are there, and I don't think that the immediate kind of treatment of fetuses as full people is appropriate at this point. And there are competing rights. I mean, there is this sort of huge body of philosophical work on the sort of problem of, and actually Kennedy just referred me to a great essay which posits, among other things, what if you woke up one morning and found that an incredibly talented violinist had been grafted onto one of your kidneys and you were the only match that could keep him alive? And that you either had to sort of stay in bed with him for 9 months or 9 years or 9 days or 9 minutes, and what are our moral intuitions about that scenario, and how is it analogous to pregnancy? So as someone who is currently deeply resentful of like the sharing of my kidneys right now, I do see some space in this debate for the competing claims point.
I was just going to say, who says libertarian thought is not always practical?
Yeah.
I mean, we have to think about these.
Any morning you could wake up with this violinist,
Actually,
and then where would you be? This actually isn't a libertarian at all. It's just a philosopher.
It is one thing that I do.
I'm betting it was a violinist.
It's something I was thinking, someone had said to me the other day that there are no children in Ayn Rand novels, and it is definitely a truth.
A lot of people would say there are no adults in Ayn Rand novels either.
But it is...
And the real nerds would say, actually, there are like 2 of them right at the end of Atlas Shrugged,
yes,
so there.
Yes, okay, well, but it gets to the problem that we have in general with libertarianism, which is that it is like the most perfect system in the world until children are involved. So I do think these are very important debates for us to be having. If everybody were an adult, these debates would be so much easier. When people are reliant on us, these debates are much more difficult, whether they are grafted onto our kidney or otherwise.
I have to say, this sort of libertarianism is perfect and ideal and utopian, except for this thing that it fails to deal with. I think those arguments are rarely true, and I think you've probably been in debates about other issues on which you are sort of taking the libertarian position, and people say, oh yes, that's all very well and good, but it's not practical, or libertarianism doesn't have room for these practical considerations. And you often would say, no, it does. Let me explain it to you. I actually think the same is true of children, and that argument is just sort of an unfair.
Well, I think just in general, in terms of how we always talk about individual rights, children bring up a whole host of obligations which are not as friendly to the general discussion.
Maybe we're not doing a very good job of talking about individual rights.
No, that's interesting. And I also think that it's worth thinking about generational changes in this. A lot of people in the modern libertarian movement, a lot of men got into it because of the military draft, and a lot of women got into it about abortion rights or reproductive choice. And, that's 40, 45 years ago, and we've dealt with a lot of these issues in ways that what it means to be a libertarian and to talk about things now is very different. Because I know a lot of the people, when I started at Reason 20 years ago, a lot of the people who were there had not had children, and all of my colleagues, basically, with the exception of Ron, have children. So this idea that libertarianism is somehow particularly, incapable of dealing with children, I think might have been true. Certainly it seemed to have been true in Ayn Rand's world. Not so true anymore. But
Also, weirdly, except for you, all of them have girl children.
well, yeah. I have often
Randomness.
I have often described myself as a double genetic loser, and I am happy. That means my kids are quintuple, or I don't know. They have wrinkled peas, I'm sure. For the Mendel fans out there, we will end this good conversation. I think I've learned a lot, and I hope other people found it interesting and stimulating and provocative to really kind of test the boundaries or kind of kick the tires on a topic which is of great importance, and also one that is not perhaps as clear, as other kinds of concerns and topics for libertarians. So again, I want to thank Mollie Hemingway of Ricochet and GetReligion.org for participating, along with Ron Bailey, Reason science correspondent, and Katherine Mangu-Ward, a Reason's managing editor, and about to become a mother of two over the course of the next few months. So, and thank you all for coming.